couple of times this week, past week, I had experiences with parents who had lost a child. One was just last night, and one was a little earlier in the week. In the one case of last night, it was a young man in his 20s. And earlier in the week, it was the case of parents who were parents for the first time, and their child was stillborn. And I mention that because when we look at today's gospel, when we look at the first reading today, we see that David, that very complex individual, on the one hand, very clever, very astute, lustful, murderous. He writes the Psalms, at least some of the Psalms, an accomplished musician and singer. This very complex man weeps because of the death of his son, Absalom. Now, Absalom, as we heard, was out to take away the throne from his father. He was angry at his father because he had done nothing to punish his half-brother, who had raped Absalom's sister. Remember, when all of these terrible things that David did were told back to him by the prophet Nathan, Nathan told him that God was saying that the sword would never depart from his house. And so what David had done, even though David repented, was going to have long-lasting repercussions through the generations of his family, as a reminder of how infidelity to God and all of the terrible things that David did would continue to affect people for a long, long time to come. And so there he is. And once he told them before they went out to battle against Absalom and his minions that they should really try hard not to hurt him. Now, David didn't outrightly forbid that they should kill him, but tried to make sure that it didn't happen. And then when it does happen and he gets the report, all he can do is weep. Because in all that complexity of emotion that David possessed was still that heart of the Father and for his children. And as you might imagine, the other two cases I mentioned had equal emotion to go along with the loss of their children. And I know there are some of you here who have lost children, and you know that that's a pain like no other. And it is something that reminds us all the time of how fragile human life can be, of how easily it can happen that we lose this most precious person that has come into our life. And unfortunately, it happens so often in our world, not just in the poorest of countries, but certainly in our own. And it's not always because of an action that one does oneself, or that happens because of something in the natural process that goes around. But a lot of times, the violence that we hear so often about, and we are bombarded by what happens over a weekend in Chicago, let alone multiply that by stuff going on through our country and throughout the world. how many young people's lives die because of violence. And that's, sometimes we can become so protective, self-protective, because it's not our experience, that we can fail to be moved by it in any way. Well, I can't control that, or I can't do this. And it's a self-preservation technique that our mind produces, that's part of our human nature, so that we don't collapse under the weight of such things. It doesn't mean that we're bad. It means that we're human. But the danger always is that we stop feeling any kind of sympathy, let alone having empathy for people who go through that. And I think that, when Paul talks to the Ephesians in the second lesson today, he's trying to remind them again, as he's getting near the end of the letter, of how they ought to be living as disciples of Christ. Because they know what's been done for them. They understand something of what they have received through no merit of their own, but through the graciousness and the generosity and the kindness and the compassion of God. And in fact, one of those sentences from today is one of the offertory sentences in the Eucharistic rite. Walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself for us, an offering and sacrifice to God. It's an exhortation to the community of imitation of Christ as fully as one can by the grace that God gives to one or the others. And that has to be something that over the course of our living begins to soak in more and more, to come to be more and more important to you and to me, that we would walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself for us. Our willingness to relate, to care, even though we can't do anything directly about a situation. Maybe all we can ever do is pray, but at least we can do something. People discount the value of prayer, but they don't understand how this is an entry into this mystery of human life in union with God. And that's that mystery that Jesus is talking about in the gospel today. Jesus is still talking in a way that the people at least can take, even though it's getting increasingly more difficult for them. Because their leaders keep attacking Jesus. We know where you're from. We know your mother and your father. How can you say that you are the bread that has come down from heaven? And so he tries to tell them, our translation is kind of lousy at one point today, because the word, when Jesus says, stop complaining, the word was, stop your murmuring. This murmuring was what the Jews did in the desert when God was feeding them with quail and with manna, and they got tired of eating it, and they would murmur among themselves. Or when there was problem with the lack of water, they start murmuring against God and against Moses. So this murmuring stuff, this, talking amongst themselves, and then finally maybe somebody making a confrontation, was part and parcel of their character. And Jesus was trying to remind them that if you come to me, you will find rest for your souls. If you come to me, you won't be hungry anymore. You won't be thirsty anymore. And he's not talking about physical hunger and thirst. He's tried to bring them along the way from where they started out, chasing him down after the miracle of the loaves and fishes. He's trying to get them to understand it. But if they believe in him, if they accept what he has to say, if they can take in what he's teaching, then they will not be hungry anymore. They won't be hungry anymore for the truth. They won't be hungry anymore for love. They won't be hungry anymore for understanding. They won't be hungry anymore for peace. They won't thirst for justice. They will begin to know it if they believe in what he has to say. But they'd rather complain because you can't say that, because who do you think you are? You're from Nazareth, for God's sake. You know? Who are you? But yet, as we'll hear over the next week or two, as we round up John's Gospel, that Jesus is talking about something that you and I know more intimately by faith. And that is the actual participation in this divine life. That we partake of the divine life. And that the sign and seal of that partaking of the divine life through our baptism is that Eucharist that we share Sunday by Sunday. That coming together of ourselves and Jesus Christ in the body and blood that he gives of himself to us, to bind us more closely to him and through him with one another, so that we don't become calloused, even as we self-protect, so that we keep in mind that call of how to live as disciples, and to not and to not push aside that because it didn't happen to me, I don't care. But to understand that all of us on this human journey need to care for one another, need to walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself for us, an offering and sacrifice to God. So that no matter how we encounter bad news, or go through difficult times, or suffer losses, or see the losses of others, that we never lose heart, because the Lord has called us to be the witnesses to the truth of his love and mercy and justice, and that we are the ones that are called to live it out day by day in the way we conduct ourselves. And we, just by our good and faithful living, our faithful following of Jesus, of trying to be faithful to our prayer, faithful in our loving and our caring for one another, and open to what God might be calling us to, those are the ways that we walk in love. Those are the ways that we can empathize with parents who lose children sometimes in violent ways. How we can never forget that we are on this journey together, and it's together that we strengthen one another by our faith, by our care, by our concern, to walk it faithfully out to the end and not lose heart and not become bitter and closed and become like so many others around us in our society who couldn't care about anybody but themselves. And even then, they probably don't even do that, because they are so insulated and angry and resentful and hurt and whatever else that they cocoon themselves off and refuse to allow anything to come in or to go out. As the Lord feeds us today, We ask Him to help us to be able to walk in love as He loves us, and that we might continuously serve in such a way that we understand that our lives are an offering and a sacrifice to God.